got a PhD from University of Cambridge, studied psychology. I have this book, this relatively popular Substack, studied undergrad at Yale. And so I think often when people hear those things, they'll make some assumptions about me. But, um, the book covers my relatively unusual and turbulent path to higher education. Grew up in foster homes, never knew my father, um, was adopted, and my adoptive family, we settled into this kind of dusty blue collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff. And, we just grew up kind of poor, pretty tough life. There was divorce and separation and other kinds of drama and turmoil, which, we can get into. I cover this in the book. Um, Enlisted in the military right out of high school when I was 17. Um, and yeah, just had to work really hard to remake my fortunes and get where I am today. And I'm hoping, yeah, just sort of being through and being in this position and experiencing everything that I'd experienced, that I can, sort of unearth some insights or some wisdom or something useful from my, kind of chaotic early life experiences and my, somewhat, I don't know, hopefully novel and interesting insights into, class and status and reputation and all these things that people tend to care about from a kind of personal but also psychological perspective. I tried to blend my academic expertise with some of my sort of more personal observations and reflections.
I really do think the listener, whatever that archetype may look like, may see this as a really insightful insight into a life that they might not have lived, or perhaps a life that they might not see represented in media or on TV. It feels like social
Mhm.
class and perhaps backgrounds of family instability aren't really highlighted in the public domain as much as perhaps gender or race or sexuality. Why do you think that is
Mhm.
from your personal experience, Rob?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, at least, I come at this more from the American perspective, but I think a lot of it applies to the UK as well. I mean, I've lived here for a few years too, and it just seems like it's like the people who get to sort of shape media and the public conversation and discourse, they just seem less interested in questions around class. Um, I think maybe because it's a harder issue to solve or to mitigate. Um, if you have a certain number of seats at a prestigious university or at a top um, firm or office, you can sort of set some of those seats aside for people who, maybe have had, they have membership in historically mistreated groups. Um, but often to even be aware of those seats in the first place, you already have to sort of be in a position, you have to be a member of a certain social class and have a bit of that background to even be aware of them. And it's just so much harder to sort of reach into these marginalized, poor, dispossessed communities and sort of even put these on their radar. I mean, every once in a while you'll see a show where they do depict class, but I don't know what it is. It's just sort of more recent hostilities or resentments or class warfare. But I'm thinking, again in the U.S. context, there's like the show Roseanne. There was a show called Shameless, which I think was originally a UK show, and then the Americans adapted it. And these are like pretty good shows, but those are kind of like those are um, in the past. I don't see it as much sort of discussed recently, and yeah, so that's one of the things I'm hoping to do with my book is to sort of bring to light, some of the challenges around class and how, it's under discussed. And I think because also the way that the system has been set up, I mean, it's harder. It's hard. Like social mobility has slowed. There's interesting research on this. It's kind of solidified. It's become more entrenched, and so it's just people don't want to dedicate, I think, the attention and the resources that would be required to seriously understand why this is the case. And the other thing is, and I do this with a lot of my writing, is, you know, people, members of the middle or upper middle class, I think from my context, when I talk about the US, I'm talking more about the upper middle class. I think in the UK, you would just say middle class. But this group, they're human like anyone else, and they don't want to be ridiculed or criticized. And when they allow someone into that circle from another class background, um, often that person will point out some of their flaws or misunderstandings or sort of misguided notions. I do this, with this term luxury beliefs. And I can't help but wonder sometimes, like back when back when I was relatively quiet and I wasn't so um, public with my writings and my concerns, a lot of people at Yale, people at these elite universities, they liked me. And I noticed the more open I become, sort of the fewer invites I receive, the fewer nice emails, the fewer, so it's, I can feel them sort of withdrawing because they don't like to be criticized. But I think honestly, a lot of the criticism is well deserved. I think if anything, they deserve more, but that's another, that's another topic.
I must laugh at that, Robin. Reflecting on that as well, I think perhaps because social mobility or lower socioeconomic background is such an invisible trait, like you can't walk into a boardroom and see how diverse it is. Perhaps there'll be some markings, whether it's how people dress or their accents, that might give that away. But besides that, it's largely invisible. I think
Hmm.
there is a huge disempowerment, whether that's because of the individual or because of the system, for people not to speak up about their story. They don't feel comfortable sharing some of the traumatic facets that come with a lower socioeconomic or family insecure kind of background. And coupled with that, unlike perhaps, I guess, sexuality or race, there's not been, or at least from my understanding in the UK, like a historic event that specifically moved the media narrative towards that demography. Like, for example, we had BLM that
Hmm.
put kind of race inequality on the map, or we had Stonewall with sexuality, but we haven't really had one for class. Do you think that's maybe a consideration as well, Rob?
I mean, yeah, I think that's a consideration. I guess like it's funny. Like I could imagine someone listening to this and suggest like the sort of communist or socialist movements. But the thing is, like, if I have read some of the history of these movements, and even those are led by like middle class and above people. I mean, we don't have to go into like the whole sort of history of communism, but people like Mao, people like Pol Pot, Lenin, these were educated people who basically, like found ways to mobilize certain groups and so even those were sort of educated people. We haven't really had, I think, yeah, the same kind of reckoning with people who are from sort of impoverished backgrounds, especially in sort of modern Anglo countries, to really sort of understand what's been going. Every once in a while, there's like a show or a book or a movie, and it's sort of on people's radar for like 2 weeks, and then it just kind of falls by the wayside. And yeah, I think it's just it's a more awkward and almost sort of irresolvable um, challenge, I think, and like you said, you can't really like, if you're a member of a certain ethnic group, or I guess even, maybe to a lesser extent to, a member of a certain like sort of sexual group or something like sexual minority, LGBT, you can kind of sometimes tell, or you sort of frequent the same communities and groups and so on. So you can sort of identify one another through how you dress or whatever, but less so with class. And so it's just harder, I think, to sort of create a movement around that and to sort of advocate for your interests in that way. Um, and so, yeah, this is, I think, yeah, the social mobility question. It'll kind of always be with us too. I just think like the whole idea of it, upward mobility, is an interesting question of what that experience is like. I'm also interested in what downward mobility looks like. Um, I know people who have like relatively rich parents, and they themselves are not that competent. They aren't like particularly creative or interesting or smart. I'm just being honest. But they grew up rich, and there's no way they're going to be able to retain or like manage the wealth that their parents had or whatever their family had accrued. And, I've heard stories and received emails from people who were like, yeah, I just didn't know what to do, or I just, didn't have it. And they kind of slipped down that ladder. Those stories are actually less often told. I'm actually, those are interesting too. Like maybe because they're more depressing, right? Like in some ways, yes, like the where you start at the bottom and sort of climb your way up, those are inspiring stories. And I think my book to some extent has a bit of that kind of. trajectory, that ascent. But when rich people becoming poor, it's like, I don't know, kind of less exciting and kind of sad at the end. So maybe that's why.
Maybe that's the second book, Rob. Maybe that's the title for that.
When I lose everything and fall back down. Yeah, that'll be part two. Yeah, I'll intentionally like wreck my reputation and my life and my career just so I can write a book about it. Yeah, I don't know. That's yeah, but those stories. I think those stories should be told too.
Well, by hosting, yeah, I hopefully won't be the vehicle for that. Hopefully, I don't ask an outlandish question that gets you cancelled on the way down, Rob. But
It's fine. It's fine. If you get canceled, it's okay.
heading back into your story, I've seen you being referred to as self-made by like the New York Times. And when I
Mhm.
think about where you were speaking about these kind of traditional institutions that would have seats reserved, perhaps for people like us, that, like you said, there's a notion to believe that we would have awareness of that opportunity. But in fact, people from our backgrounds don't typically have the awareness, therefore, the access to the opportunity. So by hearing that you've been described as somewhat self made, that infers that there's an upbringing where you have no role models, no resources, and no opportunities. And you have created that awareness to opportunity by yourself. That being
Mhm.
said,
Yeah, I mean,
I just
mhm.
want to know how you wrestle with the idea of being called self made by the New York Times.
Self-made. Yeah. Well, that was, to be clear, that was, when did they call me? That was 2015 when they described me that way. That was before the New York Times. The New York Times was just a different organization 9 years ago than it is now. Um, so I think like back then it was, that it's today they would, I don't think they would print that. I don't, it's a thorny question. What does self-made mean? Because everyone who's experienced any degree of success in their life, they've had help, they've had assistance. I document in my book, I name people who helped me and express my gratitude for the people along the way. And so what does self-made really mean? It's hard to I think like a very simple way, one way to think about it, it's imperfect, right? Because whatever definition, it's going to be insufficient. But one way to think about it would be, if you have two people with roughly the same ability, kind of raw ability there, but then sort of one of them achieves sort of unpredictable and outsized success given their circumstances compared to someone else with sort of equal raw ability in that same situation, to some extent, I think you'd call them self-made, right? Like there are a lot of people who had, really incredible, really athletic and incredible basketball skills, but there was only one Michael Jordan. And I'm not uncomfortable saying Michael Jordan was self-made to some extent, even though I'm sure he had help along the way. There are a lot of really smart people who study at Harvard and try to launch a successful startup, but there's only one Zuckerberg or only one Bill Gates, right? So, are they self-made? Not kind of, not really, but sort of. And so it's like, I don't, I don't shy away from the label, but I'm very open to say that like a truly self-made person, meaning like, no contact, no help, no assistance, that doesn't really exist in the real world. Um, that being said, I really like all of those relationships and all of the assistance I received to some extent, even that you could argue is earned, right? Like people are busy, people have to make sort of snap judgments whether to help someone. And if you present yourself in a certain way, if you sort of win people's trust, even that you could argue has been earned in some way. And so you could say that maybe that contributes to this idea of being self made. Because I did have to, I received a lot of help and I'm grateful for it, but it wasn't as if, I was just on my futon, eating chips, and then someone comes up and says, hey, can I give you a hand to whatever, study at this university or do this thing or join the military or what have you. It was like I was out there hustling and scraping and doing whatever I could to like find my way in the world. So, it's a complicated answer, but that's the best I could make of it.
No, I love it, and I think maybe like to coin your phrase, labeling yourself as self-made is perhaps a luxury belief itself. We kind of overlook all the people that, whether it was directly or indirectly, kind of touched our lives, and whether we sought after those connections or not is arguable. But I one thing that I dislike, perhaps, or one thing that I am aware of, especially by having this podcast, is not playing social mobility top trumps. whereby like the most exuberant story wins and therefore discredits
Mm,
everyday people from asking for help from a weak tie that's close to them. They see perhaps a
yeah.
let me think of someone, for example, I had Scotland's richest man, Scotland's first billionaire, who went from selling shoes at a market to amassing over £1 million in net worth. That might seem unattainable to many. And if he labels himself as self made, that might mean or showcase to my neighbor next door that that is unattainable for him and it was a breakaway success. And I think by you even
Hmm.
showcasing that you had help along the way to get to the Air Force, perhaps, or into the military, is such a great message. I'm not particularly comfortable with the definition, or particularly comfortable with showcasing that I'm self-made either, because I had charities and connections that helped me. So yeah, thank you for bringing that to life. That being said,
Hmm.
I'd love to go back into the early memories of Rob. What did life
Mm.
truly look like?
I mean, it was. I mean, so if we're gonna go like way, way back, like early, early. Well, in my book, I open with my very first memories. Well, actually, I don't open with that. I open with something else, but then it goes directly into my first memories, which is, with my birth mother. Um, and we were homeless for a while. We lived in a car. We eventually settled in this slum apartment in Los Angeles where I was born. Um, and we'd been in this apartment for a few weeks, and my mom was just extremely neglectful. She was addicted to drugs. She was just not in a position to take care of me. Um, later I was adopted, and my adoptive mother gave me this very thick file with like reports from social workers and forensic psychologists and all of these people involved in my case. And I read through them and found, it was basically, these reports saying my mother was, just very unwell. She would have men and people coming in and out of the apartment at all hours of the day and night, trading favors for drugs and just, locking me away and just like ignoring me. And eventually some neighbors called the police and they came. And so then the very first like clear, vivid memory I have is the police basically separating us and putting my mom in handcuffs, putting me in the system. Never knew my father. My mother didn't even know who my father was. I didn't know anything about him until I took a 23andMe, one of these like genetic ancestry tests recently, and went my whole life without knowing like my father's background, and learned that he was Mexican. He had ancestry from Spain and uh, North America. Basically, he was like he's Hispanic, and so that was news to me. My mother, my birth mother, she came to the U.S. from Seoul, South Korea, when she was a young woman to study, but then she just started doing drugs and started hanging out with people who didn't necessarily have her best interest in mind. And so, yeah, I got put into the foster system when I was 3. Spent the next few years living in different foster homes. Some of these homes, I mean, it was like I sort of experienced the entire spectrum of what foster homes look like. I mean, Los Angeles has one of the most overburdened systems in the country. Um, just a surplus of kids that need homes and not that many foster parents. And so some of these homes that I lived in, this was, the mid late 90s, these homes had, upwards of 8 or 10 kids living in them. I remember homes that had like 4 kids to a room with like 2 bunk beds. So, 2 kids on top, 2 kids on the bottom. And, like I'm sure some of these foster parents had, the best of intentions, but, you know, they also receive a stipend for each kid that they take care of. And so if you can manage to take care of, in quotes, take care of 10 kids, you get whatever, several $100s per child, and you can sort of turn that into, a profit if you don't really direct those resources to the kids the way that you should. And so, um, it was hard, man. Just like the first couple of homes, I remember, my social worker would come every few weeks or every few months, take me to a new home. I'd start at a new school. It was just a lot of chaos. It was just a whirlwind. At one point, I was doing so badly in school. I was changing schools all the time, changing homes all the time, complete unpredictability and instability, that I had to take this test. They thought I had a learning disability. My social worker and my foster mom and the teachers were like, "Oh, Robert's not doing so well. Maybe he has a learning disability." And at the time, I took this test and whatever. It was like I didn't understand what was going on. But in hindsight, it's like, you're taking this kid and changing homes and changing schools every couple of months. He's not doing well in school, and the first thing you think is, oh, he has a learning disability. You're going to medicalize him, put a label on it, give him some. Fortunately, I did like just well enough on this test to convince them that I didn't have a learning disability. It wasn't intentional. I just took the test and kind of gave this half-hearted effort. And but I could imagine if I had really just completely checked out and not tried on this test, like they would have medicated me. Um, and so that's something, I critique in the book too, is this idea that, foster kids or poor kids have, really unstable and chaotic lives. And, sometimes they act out or behave in ways that adults don't like. And immediately they just think, oh, let's just medicate him, or let's just give him something to pacify this kid. Um, Instead of actually looking at the root issue of what is his home life like. Does he have adults around him that he trusts, or her? So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a snapshot into what the foster system looks like. And I think it's I mean, it's basically like that for any kid in any kind of major city in the US. I actually don't know that much about the foster system in the UK, but my guess is it's probably not that different.
Thanks for sharing that, Rob. Very authentic and transparent, and just very alarming as a whole. A question that came to mind when you were sharing that with me was how might that how that might adapt your inner monologue. Was there any sort of things that you told yourself about yourself because of the constant instability and relocation, perhaps being deemed as unlovable, um, things such as that?
I mean, I didn't yeah, the question of the inner monologue, I didn't really, again, it wasn't like a lot of these thoughts and a lot of the experiences, they become a part of you. They stick with you. And it's not a conscious thing like, oh, I went through foster care and I'm having this really difficult life. And therefore, my monologue is, I think it's just sort of unconscious, implicit. And it wasn't until, I mean, a lot of this, I didn't even think about it until I was an adult, because when I was a kid, it was just such a part of my everyday existence and such a, like, and it was the kids around me too, my foster siblings later when I was growing up in Red Bluff after I was adopted. It was also like, the friends that I had were growing up in single parent homes, single moms, one friend raised by a single dad. I had a friend raised by his grandmother because his dad was in prison and his mom was on drugs. Like, those were very common stories in a lot of kind of dispossessed working class kind of blue collar areas of the country. Was like that where I was in California. And so, because my life was like that and the lives of those around me, it didn't really dawn on me just how it had changed my view of myself or my self image or my hopes for the future, my levels or lack thereof of optimism. And so, yeah, as an adult, I sort of realized, like, man, I didn't really think about like the word love was just so uh, unfamiliar to me. Like the not the word, but the feeling, the sentiment attached to it. Um, there's a lot of interesting research in developmental psychology about how kids, basically for children, the first roughly 5 to 7 years of their life, those are sort of, researchers, psychologists will call this like the critical period of development, or sort of sensitive windows of development, where, if a kid during those early years, if they don't form a secure attachment to a caregiver, usually the mom, sometimes the dad, but some adult, a trusting sort of secure bond. If they don't develop that, then later they have a lot of difficulties with trust, with relationships, with sort of depth of feeling, love, that all of those things. And so, yeah, I had difficulty with those things. And then later, recognizing it was hard. I think for a long time I had a suspicion about this, but I didn't want to confront it until I mean, basically later. Like, once I was old enough and kind of mature enough to really think about it, then it was helpful to reflect on it and realize how it had been. affecting a lot of my relationships and the way that I thought about things. But yeah, it was. I mean, this is something I think that goes under discussed in questions around social mobility. For example, if you grow up poor, if you grow up in foster homes, you just grow up in chaos and squalor. Um, of course, there's the material impoverishment that presents obstacles, but then there's also that kind of social or emotional poverty too. Um, and I think that presents at least as large an obstacle as simple material poverty. And that's a harder that's perhaps a harder challenge to resolve, but I think it needs to be discussed.
I think you're right. You're absolutely right. I remember reading some stats around why social mobility isn't something we should worry about, and it refers to, I think, kids whose parents or mother is mentally ill and determines if it had worsened their life outcomes. And the metrics that they
Hmm.
looked at was something along the lines of school attainment or school grades. And all in all, they were quite academic. But in fact, what it doesn't measure, like you said, is these hard to measure outcomes. For example, loneliness, inability to love, untrustworthiness. And I think about my own story, and I think perhaps now that you've eliminated yours, like how on paper, if you were to write down our CVs, we would look that we had a good, like a wholesome and true and perfect trajectory almost. But in fact, there is some
Hmm.
of the most consequential, important facets of life that we might have negative outcomes in. For example, a life partner is probably the most important thing, or one of the most important things that you choose to do. But if we have childhood experiences that negate our ability to make that well informed or do that as a whole, then of course our economic and mental health outcomes might be affected in the long run.
That yeah, that's so well put. That's really important. Yeah, like I mean, a point that I repeatedly stress in the early and later parts of the book is this idea that these kind of external badges of success will those are sort of the be all and end all, that if we just get more poor kids, kids from low income families into universities, get them into high paying jobs. If we just, on paper, like we'll just sort of see a greater increase in social mobility, and that's the ultimate aim. And I'm thinking like, that's fine, but that shouldn't be the only thing we focus on. There are other avenues to happiness and to what a successful and flourishing life looks like. And it's not, you can live a flourishing life without going to university, right? Like if you have loving parents and maybe you're not in a position to go on to university, but you find a loving partner and you build a family with them and you work a kind of working class or blue collar job, but you have relationships and people around you that you care about, that can be just as flourishing as, probably even more so, than if you have a really chaotic background and then you go on to achieve that sort of material success that we focus so much on, going to a fancy university, prestigious place, and getting a high paying job. And, in the meanwhile, you may have some difficulty with relationships, with love, with all of those things that we've been speaking about. So, yeah, I mean, one of the points that I describe in the book is how, if you look at the outcomes, the outcomes that we tend to care about for kids in um, impoverished backgrounds, likelihood of addiction, likelihood of incarceration, likelihood of dropping out or succeeding in the educational system. Um, what I was shocked by when I was looking into the research on this question was, what are the predictors that lead to detrimental outcomes for kids? And researchers make this distinction between um, childhood poverty, which is basically, how low income parents, and childhood instability. And this is a more sort of complicated measure, which essentially, it asks questions like, how frequently did you relocate when you were growing up? Were you raised by a single parent or with two parents? Were there divorces in your family and separations? And if so, how many? If you lived with a single parent, how many different partners, like romantic partners, did they have while you were growing up? So just basically like day to day uncertainty and disorder and chaos. And what the researchers found is that childhood poverty had the relationship between poverty and those outcomes I mentioned, incarceration and addiction and dropping out of school and so on, it's kind of tenuous. Some research shows a kind of a weak correlation between those things. Other research finds no correlation at all. But researchers find a strong and consistent relationship between instability and detrimental outcomes for kids later in life. And even when they control for income, they still find that instability is a strong and significant predictor of detrimental outcomes later. So, one way to think about this would be, if a kid is raised by rich parents, but the parents are neglectful, they get divorced, they're alcoholics, they have a string of different relationships. And so, yeah, maybe the kid is rich and, they send him to different boarding schools and what have you. There's just a lot of instability and uncertainty in that rich kid's life. Odds are, he's going to have a harder life later, um, than a poor kid who has two married parents, who prioritizes the interest of the child and tries to make sure that he has a sort of a safe and secure life, in his early upbringing. So, I think this is like, just important, right? Like, yes, material poverty is something that we should focus on, but just as much we should be focusing on these other questions about, what is a good environment for a kid? What predicts flourishing lives later, happiness and success, and all of those kinds of things. And we, I think, like kind of overweight stories like mine almost, where it's, yeah, like you said, hey, on paper he's doing great. But, this book is almost like what isn't on paper, what you wouldn't learn looking at someone's resume, of all of the sort of setbacks and hiccups and self doubt and all of the things that sort of accompany that, kind of the emotional poverty of growing up, um, kind of in that kind of chaotic situation.
Uh, And I can imagine whether it's through media or through articles or through the access to the internet, there's almost a user manual that a young person can follow or use to get into a university or a high paying job. It's very much predetermined and
Mm,
somewhat well known if you have access to those sites. Whereas flourishing in relationships and your relationship with your kids, if you have them, or friendships, there's no distinct user manual that you can follow really for them. And I guess you probably have to lean on
mm,
what you see around you, which is perhaps poor parental role modeling, or no role modeling whatsoever. So, if I were to ask you, Rob,
mhm.
how, if we were to create a user manual to help others thrive in those facets, especially those from perhaps a similar background to you, do you have any like core tenets that you'd prescribe based on your own experience?
I mean, I think it's, one of the things that helped me, and I think this is like by now this is borne out in a lot of studies and research, that if a kid is in a situation where like they don't have the most attentive parents, or they're in a kind of chaotic environment, that if they find like one adult who cares about them, then, it could be a teacher, it could be a coach, it could be anyone, like that can go a long way, in like, having a decent role model. Now for me it was weird because like there was just so much drama and chaos in my life, that like, I had a good boxing coach when I was a kid. I had like, teachers would often attempt to, um, mentor me. I wasn't always receptive to it. I was just like a really angry, stubborn kid. Um, but I do remember like distinctly whenever adults would, try to give me some advice. I was usually pretty good at spotting good advice, even if I wasn't always good at, sort of adhering to it or implementing it in my life. So it really, it kind of depends on the kid's personality too. That like there's not a one size fits all. You can have the best mentor in the world, but if there's a kid who's just really, bad attitude and really stubborn and not really open to it, like there's only so much you can do. So, um, in my case, this was a different era. I mean, now with smartphones and everything, it's just so different. And in some ways, it's better. But like, I'll just say, when I was a kid, I read a lot. I would read memoirs. I would, watch like boxing documentaries or athletes or sports, and like all of those things. I think were really helpful for me. Just this idea of being disciplined and focused to achieve your goals. That was really helpful for me. Um, and I think like, sometimes today when I see like TikTok and YouTube and all these things, like I get worried for kids, like because there's just like an endless array of content. A lot of it isn't always good. Um, a lot of it is flashy and interesting and edgy and attention grabbing, but that doesn't necessarily equate with it being like good advice or good information. But on the other hand, there are like great people out there that you can find online. Like this podcast would be like a good resource. There are a lot of kids who, if they pull up a podcast and you can listen to like the smartest people in the world talk about their experiences and the things that they've overcome. And so I think in that sense, technology can be a good thing. But yeah, I was kind of in the analog, when I was a teenager, this was like the mid 2000s. And so, yeah, it was more like reading and speaking with people and doing like movies, pop culture, like trying to piece together some kind of vision of my future. But yeah, it's not that simple, and in some ways, the kid has to like they have to find it themselves. I think you can attempt to foist it, but for a lot of kids, they're just going to sort of withdraw if they sense like an adult trying to. One thing that I've actually recommended for parents is like if you find out that your kid likes a certain influencer, podcaster, or author, whatever, to also learn about that person too. And if you can like sort of track down good advice from that podcaster or influencer, like, oh, he's saying this about discipline or hard work or whatever you want to communicate to your kid, like share that clip with your kid, because if you tell them to work hard, the kid's going to be like, oh yeah, of course you're my parent, you're going to say that. But if their favorite influencer says it, they're going to be more open, more receptive to it. It's harder, right? Because you have to do research and you have to like actually figure out what your kid is doing. But I think that can also go a long way too. Yeah.
I love it, Rob. Throughout listening to the guests that I've had on the podcast, especially those who have been on a transformative journey or a social mobility journey as such, there seems to be a golden thread of them having a kind of pivot moment, like a almost like a sliding door moment where it was an access to a new opportunity, an access to a new role model, or an access to a resource like a book. In your story, given that you went on to be in the Air Force and then go on to study at Yale and Cambridge. Do you remember a specific, for better or for worse, pivot moment that changed your trajectory?
I mean, probably the biggest. I mean, there were a few, but the earliest and probably the biggest one was, joining the military, enlisting in the Air Force right out of high school. I was 17 years old. I had to have my adoptive mom sign what was basically a permission slip because I was underage. Um, you can join when you're in the U.S. You can join when you're 17, but you have to have parental or guardian permission. And so I had to talk her into letting me go. I mean, you know, the situation at home and like there was just so much drama that like I think she knew it was the right decision for me. But then that one thing that did was immediately get me out of that environment that I was in, just mired in so much drama and turmoil and recklessness. I barely graduated high school. I was sort of right on the boundary of passing, and I wasn't in a position to continue my education. There was no, I could have continued working. I had two jobs in high school. I was a busboy and a dishwasher, and then later got a job as a bag boy at a grocery store. And like, I was like barely, I moved out when I was 16. I mean, I was living with my friend and his dad, and I was paying rent, and it was just like, my life was not going anywhere good. And so, I guess like, I did have a I did have these thoughts with my, thinking about my coworkers, these guys I worked with at the restaurant and at the store. These guys some of them were older than me. They were in their mid to late 20s and they were still, we had the same job. And it's like, okay, if you're bagging groceries for a living when you're 17, it's fine. But when you're 27 doing the same thing, there's something about that that's like, is this really what I want to be doing in 10 years, making the same money in the same job? Um, and like some of these guys, they were fine, but I did think it was weird. Like they would buy beer for my friends and me. They would like, get us some weed or whatever. Like, it was like we liked them. They were cool. But at the same time, I did have these thoughts of like, why are you like 27-year-old guy like hanging out with a bunch of high schoolers? Like, I don't want to be that. Like, I don't want to be the weird old guy getting drugs for a bunch of kids and like hanging out at their parties. That's just, that didn't seem like a great future. And so I enlisted, and that really just put me out of, kind of hit the eject button. I'm out of Red Bluff, California. Suddenly I'm in Texas, basic training. I'm in a different environment with different friends, different people around me, different organizational structure, different rules. I mean, I dwell at length kind of describing this parallel between me and one of my best friends in high school. So he ended up going to prison, and I joined the military. And I remember after he was sentenced to 18 months. He did 12 months and got out early. And I remember I met him and we were talking about our experiences, and we were both kind of thinking how similar life was, both especially the first couple of years in the Air Force and in any military branch. It's like it basically is prison because you have like a certain place you're supposed to live. Your life is just so regimented and structured. You don't really have any freedom. It really sucks. And I remember being 17, 18 years old going through the training and like regretting it. Like, why did I do this? This is awful. Like, I just hated every minute of it, of, going from being 17 and having relative control over my life to suddenly like some guy yelling at me because I didn't fold my shirts properly, or because my living quarters weren't spotless, or because maybe I was 1 minute late for work. Then that's like so then I'm talking to my friend and he's telling me about how, yeah, like you have to make your bed, there's lights out, there's this, you have to eat at this time, and go into the yard at this time, and everything is regimented. And he said at first he hated it, but what was weird is that even though we both really disliked the experience, I started to appreciate my experience in the military, and I understood that it was actually a good thing for me. It was beneficial. And my friend told me that he actually missed prison. He missed that structure in his life because he had too much freedom on the outside. Um, no parents, no oversight really. He grew up kind of similar to me. And that like instilled this kind of appreciation that even in the moment, maybe having rules and having boundaries and being told what to do, it's really unpleasant, especially when you're kind of a young, impulsive, reckless guy. But as you mature and grow older, you can sort of appreciate how it can make your life better in some ways. There's this. Are you familiar with Jocko
Yeah.
Willink, the Navy SEAL? He has like that popular podcast, and he one of his slogans is "discipline equals freedom." And once you have your life regimented and structured, and suddenly it does give you a bit of freedom to experiment a bit more. Once you sort of know these are the hours you're doing certain things, and it creates success, and success builds on success. But it takes a while to truly understand that, especially when you're young and you don't have much discipline in your life. So yeah, I mean that. I don't want to give the impression that I just joined and then suddenly everything was perfect and it naturally deterministically led to success for me. There were some hiccups, there were some setbacks, self doubt. I was still the same person. It just contained a lot of that recklessness in me. But that was one turning point for sure. The military.
That is super fascinating. The correlations, the correlations between your mate's time in prison and yours in the army, and I think,
Air
sorry, the
Force.
Air Force. My bad, Rob. That being said, I can imagine there's even in both environments, there's also a aspect of capability validation. Like if you perform well in the army, I can imagine you have the Air Force, your seniors will validate how well you march, how well you shine your boots, how well you adhere to the code of conduct. And I
Hmm.
can imagine the same is true of prison. And
That I don't know. I didn't ask him about that, but I'm sure, yeah, because you do, like every young guy wants respect, right? However the environment you're in, respect can be attained in different ways. But yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, that, earning the respect of the people around you, that is a strong motivator, sure.
my old man was in the army, and now he's in his late 60s. He still visits the Royal British Legion, which is a almost like a social club for veterans. And he wears his uniform. He attends the Remembrance Days, and there's still this sense of identity and brotherhood that he still strives and kind of desires, much like he had in his 20s. Reflecting on your story,
Hmm.
given that you went into further education thereafter, did you ever drop the identity and belonging and brotherhood of the Air Force, and kind of reaccustom to this new identity and belonging and perhaps brotherhood in Cambridge?
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So when it's funny, like if I think because like you suffer, right? Like suffering breeds kind of social bonds. Like this is like a well documented. This is like why hazing exists. um, like in sports teams or fraternities or militaries, like basically the idea is when people suffer together, like it just strengthens their attachment, their bond, their relationships, investments in one another. And this is why they have these situations where when you join one of these organizations, the new members are just put through like kind of a hellish environment together because it makes them feel like a brotherhood or a sisterhood or whatever. And so now if I were to meet someone who was in the Air Force versus I meet someone who went to Yale, like it's no question I would immediately feel a deeper bond with the guy who was in the Air Force because we had the shared experience. We went through basic training in the same place. Like we know the vocabulary, the lingo, the like what the bases are like, just everything about it. And so yeah, even to this day, if I meet someone, I'm like, oh yeah, where were you stationed? What was it like? And we just sort of reminisce and think about it, and kind of so it's just versus if I meet someone from Yale, I just I don't want to be mean, but my assessment of them might actually drop somewhat. That's just it's unfair, but that's and so but it's when I speak with people sometimes, and they especially when they read parts of my book when I was a teenager, and they're like, when I read about you in high school years and I meet you now, it's like two different people. Like I just can't even imagine you were like this. And what I tell people is like, I was in the Air Force for 8 years, like, and those were like 8 formative years, right? Like from 17 to 25, which are for any young man, like the difference between 17 and 25 is huge already, right? Just like in regular life, if you meet the 17-year-old version versus the 25-year-old version of any male, it's going to be two different people. But um, because I was in this like radically rigid environment and I was traveling the world, man. Like I was stationed in Germany. I did a couple of deployments. I was in Kyrgyzstan. I was in Qatar. I was in, I was just all over the place, traveling, meeting different people, living this, completely novel life. And so, 8 years later, I did it was like, it didn't completely change me. Fundamentally, I was still the same person, but I did sort of change my habits and behaviors, a little bit of my outlook and mindset. And so, of course I'd emerge different. And, now I'm just, now I'm in my 30s. So of course I'm going to be different than I was when I was 17. But I just think, those early years of early adulthood when you're still trying to figure yourself out, like, if you spend those years traveling and working or doing something that you wouldn't ordinarily do, if you just go to like some developing country and get a job there and try to learn the language or, just have some kind of adventure like that, of course you're going to be different later. um, so yeah. To your question, do I have I shed the? Not really. I think it's always going to be part of who I am on some level, right? Like I'm going to have this attachment to that organization because of what it did for me, and because of the suffering and the experiences.
In a very similar vein, I've experienced that same dialogue with people that I meet from my hometown saying, "Oh, David, you've changed so much. Even your accent's changed." And I like to thank them
Hmm.
because it is an indicator of growth. But I, I'm not sure if this phrase has ever been coined before, but I have this social mobility guilt, almost like a feeling that
Survivor's
survivor.
guilt.
Yes, exactly like that. Have you
Yeah.
faced that at all? Given the fact that you're in the 1% of educational attainment, you're writing a book, and then you go back or kind of converse with people from your upbringing, and their outcomes are very different. Do you wrestle with that at all, Rob?
Yeah, I do. It's I don't. Is it guilt? Guilt may be too strong. I do feel what is it? I guess self-conscious or something. Like I don't like when it's brought up. The longer I go on, and the more my life and career develop, like my the frequency of my communications with my old friends, the space grows longer between them. Where like when I was still in the air, we were still good friends, like up until like maybe my mid or late 20s. We would still stay in touch on a weekly or maybe monthly basis sometimes. But now it's just, every few months kind of check in, how are you? But, I did see one of my friends recently. well, recently in quotes, this was like 5 months ago. And yeah, he caught me up on like a lot of what my friends are up to and like the guys I talk about in the book. So he was one of them. He was one of the brothers that I lived with my senior year of high school. And he and I are still pretty close. That's one of those things, right? Like if you grow up together, you live with someone as a kid, like, it's just that bond will always be there. So he and I will remain somewhat close. But, when he catches me up and I hear these stories, man, it's just devastating. Where like one of my high school friends, they found him in a bathtub. He cut his wrists. Like another friend went, back in prison. Another friend who's, he lost his job and now he's, can't pay rent. And it's just those kinds of stories. It's like, I don't feel guilt, but I do feel like just awful. I just feel bad for these guys and wish that, because it's not entirely a question of poverty. Like they're not like rich. They're having some financial struggles, but it's not like they don't know where their next meal is coming from. It's like squalor, bad choices, kind of bad social incentives around them. There's so many things like, you know for someone like me, if I had stayed with them, I probably would be making the same choices and making the same mistakes and all the self-defeating behaviors. But because the incentives around me had changed, because I was in a new environment, because people were telling me what to do, and even if I didn't like it, even if I hated it, those choices were better for me at that time when I was 17. I didn't know it was best for me, but the military knew better, what was, better than I did. And so it's hard, like wrestling with that and, hearing about what's been happening. So yeah, I don't know if it's guilt, but it is like a bit of sympathy, and it's hard. It's hard to see what's become of, my hometown. I go back to Red Bluff once a year maybe, and I just see like, I think it gets worse. There's also the issue of like, this is an under discussed problem with brain drain and with mobility, is like, as as universities and as institutions and as society gets better at identifying talented and capable people, those people will relocate to city. Like they're going to go to college, they're going to go to cities where they can make money, right? Like it's just a reasonable financial and social decision. You want to go to the places where there are other educated people and other ambitious people. You want to make money, you want to be successful. And so these small towns, and I'm speaking in the US context, but I think it's true in the UK
Exactly the
too,
same.
where I'm never going to go back to Red Bluff, right? Like I'm not going to live there. But each year, anytime someone graduates from Red Bluff High and they have some promise and they go out, they join the military, maybe that's their avenue towards social mobility, or they go on to university and that's their avenue to social mobility. No one ever goes back to Red Bluff, right? They go to San Francisco or Los Angeles or wherever. And so all of the sort of capital, the human capital, is accruing in small areas, like, within cities, within metropolitan areas. And so, yeah, I see this happening, and yeah, it makes, it's kind of sad to see it, where Red Bluff is just kind of, uh, whatever. It's not doing well.
Given I've only got you for a couple more minutes, Rob, I want to shed light on something I read whereby you said you would swap your position in the top 1% of educational attainment to have never been in the top 1% of childhood instability. You're now releasing a book called Trouble that
Mm.
highlights your experience and the academic research that underpins it. If I were to ask you why that would be the case, why would you swap that 1% for the other 1%? What are some of the headlines that you would bring to life to end the podcast?
I mean, I end the book citing all of these statistics about predictors of happiness and well-being and flourishing. And educational attainment is actually not correlated with happiness at all. What seems to happen is that people expect when they get more educated that they're going to have more free time and more choices, more they get to exert more control over their life, and that isn't the case. What happens is usually education when people become more educated, they actually work more hours and become more busy, and they have less free time than they anticipated. And essentially, this has like a net zero effect on happiness. And money has kind of a tenuous relationship with happiness, up to a certain point. It's unclear. Once you have your sort of basic physical needs met, beyond that, the relationship between happiness and money isn't that clear. But what is clear is childhood stability, love, nurturing, attentive care from parents in childhood, caregivers in childhood. the link between that and happiness in adulthood, I mean, that's pretty consistent. That's pretty robust. Um, and so essentially, if you have like a very sort of lonely, neglectful, difficult upbringing, those feelings will linger, and it takes work to undo. Like I've done a lot of self work. I've done a lot of, you know, whatever. Like I've just worked on myself a lot in order to overcome those things. But it's still achieving material success and professional success doesn't suddenly make up for everything that a kid goes through. I mean, if you go to, let's say you approach a small child in an orphanage or foster care, or just like in sort of ordinary poverty with like neglectful or addicted parents or something, and you say, hey, guess what, someday you're going to go to an expensive university and do really well in your career, and you're going to make money. I think the little kid isn't going to say like, oh, okay, then this is fine. The kid's going to be like, that's what are you saying? Like, I don't care. I just want, like, I wish my mom would spend more time with me. I wish I knew who my dad was. I wish like things around me were stable and predictable and normal, and that people were paying attention to me, something along those lines, right? And so even if every kid in poor, dysfunctional, whatever backgrounds do go on to experience the kind of social mobility we concentrate a lot on, it's not going to make up for those early life experiences. Um, Look, even if a kid has, you know, even if the relationship between childhood stability and later outcomes is, there's no correlation whatsoever, I still think like we should focus on, the subjective experience of kids and what they go through. And it's under discussed, right? Like, we mentioned before, that, we talk a lot about race, we talk about sexual orientation, we talk about this group, that group. Working class people maybe don't get as much attention. The people who really have no political power, no power in society whatsoever, are kids, and especially poor kids. Like they can't exert their preferences at all. There's a quote I cite in the book from the Yale sociologist and physician Nicholas Christakis, and it's in one of his books, where he basically says, like, basically every decision around child policy in the US has been driven by the concerns and needs of adults. And what was important for children was, at best, it was a secondary concern, right? It's the adults who get to make the decisions, and kids have no say in the matter. And, I think as adults and as people with some influence in society, we could also think about their experiences too. So,
Thank you for ending the podcast on that, Rob. I've seen and read that you decorate your academic achievements as a hollow measure of success, but I hope this book, when it's released, and the profound impact it has on parents and children, I hope when you receive that feedback, and I know you've had quotes from Jordan Peterson, Yeonmi Park, Naval Ravikant, but I hope the individual parents and kids that whose life are improved by this book reach out to you, and you feel that as a huge measure of success, because I'm sure it's on its way, and I'm sure people that listen to this podcast have felt a very similar way. Thank you so much, Rob, for coming on the podcast. I really, really appreciate your time.
thank you, David. It's been great.